I've laid out the landscape, and it's pretty bleak.
Yeah, I got a couple questions based on that. I mean, I think the biggest question that comes to mind for me is this: you've laid out a potential pathway wherein Alberta could access bitumen for products still, I'll say. There's a pathway where industry could still be pulling bitumen out and doing stuff with it. I guess the question that I find myself asking is, and I kind of tried to get at this earlier, is why would they? I mean, we're talking. You just finished a pretty extensive commentary on the moral leanings of a lot of these oil and gas companies. I mean, the fact that there's stuff like liability dumping going on. There's very clearly a pursuit within these companies for what's going to give us the easiest money the quickest, and that's understandable because they do have sort of a fiduciary duty to their shareholders. So if there's clearly a pathway to still using the bitumen for other products, but it seems like the window to be able to do that and have any kind of financial return is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the question that I find myself left with is, why would these oil companies or energy companies or whatever we want to call them, why would they invest in these sorts of things, in this sort of product development, to the scale that would be required to replace the void that's going to be left if your projections around the transition are anywhere near accurate? Why would they do that? Why don't they just go down to somewhere where you can get oil cheaper or other forms of energy cheaper and more reliably and say, so long, Alberta, thanks for all the fish?
Boy, your question begs a lot of, well, the question has a lot of answers. A lot of that particular onion has a lot of layers to it. So I want to take a couple of cracks at this. One of them is, and this is fascinating. So if you and I have a liability, like if we have a debt, we have a car loan, we have to pay that liability somehow, right? You got to pay off the loan, you got to pay the bank, you got to whatever. If you're an oil company, you don't look at it that way. You're unreclaimed well sites and other infrastructure. Imagine now, once a year, during the budgeting process for an oil company, all the vice presidents come in, sit around the table, they're setting their budget. And the vice president of drilling says, we want to, if you put in X amount of millions of capital into drilling, the return on your investment will be this, X. And the other vice president says, well, if you put money into building pipelines, the return on is going to be X. And then the closure and liability guy gets up and he says, well, we have liabilities of X hundreds of millions, and we need 5 million or 10 million or whatever to close some wells. And the CEO looks at him and says, okay, but how's that going to generate revenue?
Yeah.
How's that going to make income? How does that improve our return to our shareholders if we give you that money? And the point that gets made over and over again when I talk to experts is that inside like oil companies, the various uses of capital have to compete. And if the very other vice presidents are bringing forward uses for that capital that will provide a return to shareholders, and closure and liability is a cost, you lose. They lose, and they don't get funded. That's a problem. That's the way the oil industry looks at it. And that's one of the reasons why they try to get out from underneath their liabilities by selling their wells and so on. Okay, so that's one. Now the question is, why wouldn't the oil companies pick up and move? Well, some of them have. I mean, on the conventional side, you've got Ovintiv, used to be the Alberta Energy Company, or it was Crown Corporation at one time, and it took off, and I think it moved to Texas. But the oil sands companies have taken a different route, and this is the thing that's poorly understood by its critics, is that in a well, like if you have conventional well or a shale well, you have to continually replenish your production by drilling new wells. That takes capital. It's not like that in the oil sands. At the oil sands, it's like a manufacturing plant. You build the plant, right? The resource is there. It's there to be had. You just need to build a plant to get at it. And once you've spent that capital, the amount of capital that you require and your cost per barrel is quite low. So you have a low decline rate on your resource. You have your upfront capital has been paid for, and your sustaining capital, the stuff you have to spend every year to maintain things, is very low. And the break even now in West Texas Intermediate in American dollars for oil sands companies is around $30 to $45 a barrel, going down because they're going to drive costs down further, a lot of it by laying off workers, I might add. They're going to drive it down to the mid-20s to the low 30s. That's a competitive barrel. So the oil sands is a very, very unique resource that, as long as prices stay even, above $50 a barrel, they're making good money. That's why they don't get up and move away. And they have very, specialized expertise, right? You couldn't take maybe you could take an oil sands engineer and put them in Texas to work on shale wells, but I don't think so. I mean, these guys, this is very specialized. There's really the only resource like it is in Venezuela. And so that's why the Canadian companies have grown and are acquiring, more assets and expanding all the time, is because they now have the expertise to produce bitumen very, very cost effectively. And what they've done, and this gets to the other point that you made, Nate, is they have all, and I've interviewed oil company people who have confirmed this. They they model their competitiveness out to 2050, right? So they have an economic model and they plug in their assumptions, and then can we compete or can't we compete? And all of the big companies, and which all of them are oil sands related, and some of them have conventional production as well. All of them have modeled they can be competitive in 2050, even at, they say, 25 barrels a day, 1 million barrels a day of production. So the companies are looking at that and they're going, our best return to our shareholders is to get better and better at what we do best, which is produce a barrel of bitumen for a very low cost. And investing in wind and solar, investing in these other kinds of clean energy technologies, like you see the European majors do, super majors, they're not interested in that at all. They have one focus and one focus only. Suncor, to their credit, they've invested in some of the, like Energi and all sorts of these little startups, but that's $50 million here and $100 million there. I mean, that's the coffee fund in the executive lounge for these guys. But their focus, all of their focus, is on producing bitumen, more of it at a lower cost per barrel out to 2050. That's their singular focus. So
the two things that I want to clarify there then is we're talking about two, and I'm really oversimplifying, I totally get that, but we're effectively talking about two different industries at this point, because we're talking about oil sands production and then everything else. And so it's the everything else that's going to cause us all of the problems, if I'm understanding this correctly.
Well, okay, so now this is a debate, because economists don't agree on this, the industry and their critics don't agree on this. And I've always assumed that because the oil sands has such a competitive advantage, within the 10.5 million barrels of heavy crude global market, right? Like they are very competitive. So, and for the most part, this is not 100% true, but for the most part, you can't substitute light sweet crude for ultra heavy sour crude. Like the refineries are very different. The ones processing the bitumen you have to spend about $1 billion to upgrade their kit and put in other equipment to allow you to do that. So they won't switch over to light sweet crude just because, it goes down in price. They prefer the heavy. So anyway, I always assumed that the oil sands producers were probably going to be competitive well into the 30s because they had this very unique market. And that the conventional producers who make light sweet crude, but everybody makes light sweet crude. The US produces probably, I think they produce 11 or 12 million barrels a day of it. So where is the competitive advantage for Alberta conventional producers? That was my thinking. But then a couple of weeks ago, the Canadian Energy Regulator brought out its Canadian Energy Futures 2023, where they did some net zero modeling, and they argue that in fact the conventional production will actually increase a little bit, and they think the oil sands will go down. So I need to take a little closer look at that. But I mean, these guys, these are smart economists, right? But so the point I'm trying to make here is that none of this is certain. We all have a different point of view, depending on the assumptions behind your modeling, behind how you think about the energy transition, how you think about the different oil markets. We have some ideas about where the future might go. The big trends, I think, are well established, towards renewables and away from fossil fuels. But within those trends, how Alberta will compete, what will make the grade, what won't make the grade, all of that is going to be volatile and uncertain. But here's the thing. Volatility is really bad for the oil industry, right? So in part one of Unethical Oil, I quote Donnie Bobisil. Now, Donnie is a veteran oil guy. He's probably my age, and he's, he and his team, you have in the industry, you have teams where you have a CEO and a CFO and an engineer and a geoscientist, and they go on and they do different projects. And he says, lately, it's become clear there is no more capital for us to do oil and gas projects. Only the most select teams now have access to capital. It's completely dried up because there's too much uncertainty. Who wants to invest in oil and gas production, tie up your capital for 5 years or 10 years when you can get a bit higher return somewhere else? And then there are all the other things like, climate policy regulations. Uncertainty is driving capital out of the oil and gas industry. So that's a big problem. And the volatility around that's going to be created by the energy transition, are prices going to be $50? Or are they going to be $80 a barrel or $100 a barrel? We don't know that. And so this is the time now when things are uncertain, but the trends are observable. We know what the long-term trends are, is to make the change. Because if you're going to depend on your provincial budget, and if you're going to depend on big time employment in Alberta, and you're going to depend on rural municipality tax bases, all of that kind of stuff, and you're going to try to clean up some of these oil and gas wells, good luck to you, Alberta. It's going to be a tough road to hoe.
Well, that's what I'm kind of wondering about. And the next question that I wanted to ask is, you're talking about the oil sands companies projecting that they're going to be good till 2050 with oil barrel prices very low, $20 to $30, like you said. How much of let me phrase the question this way: are you aware of any inclusion in those projections to deal with the $250 billion of liabilities that are going to exist in oil and gas because of all of those inactive and orphaned wells?
No, and that brings me to a point that I wanted to make earlier and I forgot. And that is this. It's well established, that nobody will disagree with this, I don't think, that the big public companies, the Suncors, the Cenovus, the CNRLs, the Imperial Oils, they put a lot of effort into being regulatory compliant. Regulatory compliance is a big, big thing. If you're that kind of a company, you follow the law, because the consequences for you, it's not just that, you might get your wrist slapped by the regulator, but if you're not careful, you're going to wind up being an unemployed CEO, because investors want nothing to do with companies that are regularly breaking the law in a serious way. So regulatory compliance is a really, really big deal. But the companies will not, they absolutely will not, as a general rule, spend money reclaiming and cleaning up liabilities voluntarily. They will spend the money if you make them spend the money with regulation. If you pass a regulation, and this is what the UCP did. I mean, let's give Danielle Smith credit for this. She brought in this inventory reduction program, and there's a mandatory spend, and now the industry has to spend $700 or $800 million a year cleaning up these liabilities. And they will do it, and they're already doing it. In fact, last year they spent $600 million, which was 40% over what they were required to spend. But they did it because they want to be in compliance with the regulations. So the only solution to this is a regulatory solution. The problem is that in order to fix the problem properly, to avoid the crisis we've been talking about, is you need a response that is in the billions, maybe 10 billion, tens of billions every year. And the industry will not tolerate that. They'll tolerate, between all of the companies, $600, $700, $800 million a year. But if you ask them to spend $10 billion, that would get incredible pushback. There's no way a conservative government, which is, I don't think I'm going out on a limb here to say tightly integrated with or tightly tied to the oil and gas industry. And so what you have, the solution to this is R-Star. This is why R-Star, and this is Danielle Smith's proposal that she brought in 2021 when she was lobbying for the Alberta Enterprise Group. R-Star would be $20 billion worth of credits that would cost the government $6 billion in foregone revenue. But the number is not the important thing here. It's the moral hazard. And this is an idea that I was introduced to by Professor Martin Olashinsky, a law professor at the University of Calgary. It's that there's the polluter pay principle, which says that if you pollute, you pay to clean it up. So if the government says, you know what, we're going to volunteer and we're going to pay for private companies' environmental liabilities, you violate the polluter pay principle and you create a moral hazard where you do it once, you'll do it again. And what oil company executive looking at that going, oh, okay, well, we got $6 billion towards, what are we going to get next week? What are we going to get next year? Right? And then you've opened the Pandora's box, and then you can't put it back. You can't close it again. That's what's evil about R-Star, is it violates the polluter pay principle, and it will put us on a slippery slope that the taxpayer, you and your viewers, Nate, will be paying and paying and paying and paying for decades. Because
so to be
the oil
clear,
companies,
when you said the solution is R-Star, you didn't mean the solution is R-Star. You meant it was Danielle Smith's solution.
Yes, that is exactly what I meant. So sorry if there was any confusion over that.
I just wanted to make sure, because I could see the DMs coming in already, and we haven't even released this thing. The next
Question that I have for you then, it's quite the it's quite the conundrum you've set up there, because, well, not you've set up, but you've explained there, because the only way to deal with the environmental disaster that we're sitting on is through an increase in regulatory compliance, because the oil and gas companies aren't going to be like, oh yeah, we'll totally clean our rooms, mom. There are no governments that are willing to go toe to toe with um, the oil and gas companies to bring in the sort of regulatory compliance that's required to um, resolve this situation. Not the choice words I wanted to use, but I'm trying to decrease my use of profanity. So I don't really like. That's not great. Because there's no, it seems like what you're describing is there are some optimistic solutions, there are some optimistic ways that potentially the oil sands could go towards to maintain their revenue and sort of to diversify their products. But when it comes to the question of the overall revenue for the province, and it comes to the question of the environmental catastrophe that we're sitting on, we're pretty much screwed.
Alberta, if it follows the path it's on now, is pretty much screwed. It won't be screwed next week or next year, but in the very near future. And one of the things we haven't talked about yet is regulatory and cultural capture. So this is, I did an interview with Professor Jason McLean of the University of New Brunswick. He's a law prof there and an expert in regulatory capture. And he says regulatory capture is when the regulator, not just in oil and gas, could be in electricity, could be in anything else, is when the regulator puts the corporate interest, the industry interest before the public interest. So you see all the time, that, for instance, electrical utilities, are pretty friendly with the regulator, because they swap staff and for a whole bunch of reasons. But in Alberta puts such a premium on growing the industry and keeping the industry profitable that it actually set up its regulatory system to be deliberately captured. And like Texas and other states that are, that have a big oil and gas industry, it also becomes culturally captured. So, Janet Brown, right, from the pollster, very, very well-respected pollster. Did an interview with her a couple of years ago, and her colleague, John Santos. And the data shows that over half of all Albertans identify with the oil and gas industry so deeply that their very identity is tied up in it. They are oil and gas. And so when there's an attack on oil and gas, they see it as an attack on them personally. Over half of all Albertans.
That's how Kenny won.
Well, and it's how Rachel Notley lost in 2023, in my opinion. Right? If you don't have a message for those folks around your competency to manage the oil and gas industry and create jobs, et cetera, then nobody's going to elect your party to form government, not willingly. So here's the point I want to make here, Nate, is that the regulator is captured. The Albertans are captured. The politicians are captured. The government is captured. And they've been captured for so long that nobody questions it anymore. Like if you said, oil and gas should be phased out tomorrow in downtown Alberta, you'd probably be lynched. We'd never find your body. Right?
You're not wrong.
Oh, look, I mean, you could go to some of the more trendy bars in downtown Alberta and say that, and I know they wouldn't find your body. Okay, so this is the problem, is there's no political will whatsoever to make the significant changes that are required to address the crisis that I've described today. The oil companies won't do it voluntarily. but follow the money. Because of the uncertainty around the energy transition, oil companies now give 75%, and some of them more than that, of their free cash flow back to investors. Because if you don't give them, basically start giving capital back to them, they will shut off the taps to what is a very capital intensive industry. And they will desert your stock. And the next day you will be a fired CEO. So that's their first priority. They have to give capital back to investors in the form of higher dividends and share buybacks. Just let me finish this thought.
Yep.
So the second priority is being regulatory compliant for reducing emissions, because Danielle Smith and Brian Jean can argue all they want about, they can argue against an oil and gas emissions cap, but the fact is the federal government has constitutional authority and they can bring it in. Now we'll see if they've got the political cojones to do that, but everybody expects that they will. And so the other priority for the industry, when I should also mention that there are already very tentative efforts in the oil and gas markets to start to price carbon, to price emissions intensity in a barrel of oil. And, Alberta has very high emissions intensity. Okay, so that's the second thing that they're investing in. There's no money left. There's no capital left inside the company, no revenue left, no income left for them to spend on a major reclamation or, cleanup of oil and gas liabilities on the conventional side. There just isn't. And then on top of that, the juniors companies are failing left and right. We're seeing some intermediate companies that have failed. There's fewer and fewer companies all the time and more, de facto orphan wells. So where in that scenario is a ray of sunshine? I can't find it.
Well, this is the question that I wanted to sort of ask you, because one of the things I was chatting with a friend a couple of days ago, and we started talking about the whole idea of carbon capture and reduction, and it seems to me that this was the biggest political pitch that both parties whiffed on in a huge way during the last election. Because, and this is where I'm going to ask you to tell me if my understanding is right or wrong. My understanding is when it comes to carbon capture, there's a couple steps. First, they got to capture the carbon. So largely we're talking about the big places that the carbon comes out of. I'll use the word factories because I'm lazy. But you've got the places that produce the carbon. You have to pull the carbon out of the smokestacks, if you will. But then you got to put it somewhere. And what's been explained to me is that there's two steps to putting it somewhere. The first step is you got to move it. And the second step is you got to find somewhere to store it. And there's different ways and different places to store it. One of the things that was introduced to me as an idea is the idea of, well, you've got all of these empty wells, just stuff the carbon dioxide down there and it'll be fine. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but
zero truth.
Okay, perfect. But it's, there's if oil and gas is going to be sustainable, particularly if the federal government brings in regulations, there's going to have to be a bigger conversation around carbon capture and storage. And to me, because of the infrastructure that's required to move all of that stuff in the different places it needs to go, there is the opportunity for some pretty major infrastructure projects, which to me, if I'm a politician, thank God I'm not, but if I'm a politician, I'm looking at that and I'm going, hey, you know what? We need to build this whole infrastructure thing in order to make this carbon capture and storage thing work. So, you know what? We're going to put all the welding trucks back to work. The government of Alberta is going all in on carbon capture and storage. We're going to subsidize the holy hell out of this. Maybe we'll even say, as a rough idea, you pay, and I'm making numbers up right now, 8% royalties on what you pull out of the ground. your choices are either you pay 10% royalties or you pay 8% royalties and the other 2% goes towards building these projects. There's lots of different conceivable ways to pitch an idea to finance it. Why do you think it is that we didn't hear more about not only the economic benefits of the things that you talked about earlier on, but you tell Timmy, hey, we got to build all this infrastructure. We're going to need that Weldon truck fired back up again. And you're tying back into that idea of identity of oil and gas. You're putting the prospect of jobs that a lot of people feel like they've lost back in play. Why didn't anyone pursue that idea more during the election?
Well, Alex Pourbaix, who's the CEO of Cenovus, has said that building these CCUS infrastructure is going to create 35,000 jobs. He said we're going to have a problem finding people to build this stuff.
This is what we're saying.
Let's sort of unwrap that, unpack that issue. So the oil sands companies, which have now left CAP and created their own organization called Pathways Alliance. And the Pathways Alliance estimates that to decarbonize, like basically to get to net zero for the oil sands by 2050 will cost $75 billion. Now, all you have to do is look at recent pipeline projects to know that whatever the number is, it's probably double or triple that. All right. So, but let's say $75 billion. And 2/3 of that will pay for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So that's $50 billion. So what did the oil sands companies do? They went out and they asked government, particularly the Canadian government, to give them $50 billion. Now look, if the oil sands companies want to build all the equipment on their facilities to collect CO2, and if they want to build the pipeline, and they have a project. Pathways Alliance has a project where they will build a big carbon pipeline from the 22 oil sands projects in the north, and they'll run it down northeast Alberta down to Cold Lake, and that's where they'll bury and store the CO2. So you were quite right. There's 3 parts to this: capture, transport, bury, or store, whatever. And Alberta is one of the leading jurisdictions in the world on CCUS. Last year, there were 40 megatons of CO2 captured around the world. 7 of those megatons were in Alberta.
Well, it's a good thing we produce so much.
Yeah, we got the expertise. I don't doubt that we can do it, because there's plenty of clever engineers down in downtown Calgary that have experience already designing carbon capture and storage projects. And there's also the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, right? So we know how to do that. If any place in Canada can do CCUS, it's Alberta. That's not the problem. My problem is who pays for it. And here's why. So we've been talking about some of the debate around, well, how long will the oil sands be competitive? Will it be the 2030s? Will it be out to 2050 like they think it will? Will it be what's going? We don't know. So I asked the federal energy minister, which is Jonathan Wilkinson, who is the Minister of Natural Resources. I asked his office, I pestered them, and I said to them, has the government ever undertaken a modeling exercise to estimate whether or not Canadian oil and gas will be competitive out to 2050, right? So both the conventional and on the oil sands side. And I got more weaselly words than you can imagine. So I'm going to go out on a limb, and it's a very short limb, I have to tell you. And I'm going to say that the federal government, not the Natural Resources Minister, not the federal government, have never seen a modeling estimate of whether the Canadian oil and gas industry can be competitive to 2050. They don't have a clue, right? Now, I'm sure they've sat across the table from CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and the various CEOs who have assured them that they have done modeling and that, hey, boys, everything's good here. We're fine. Don't trust us on this one. Jonathan. So it's good. What government will put $50 billion into what could be stranded assets and not even conduct a modeling exercise so that they have some idea of whether that's a good investment or not? And I've criticized the federal government for this, and they should be taken out to the woodshed and spanked for it. It's basically, this is, if they give them, they've already given them $7.1 billion in investment tax credits. Okay, so now, then after that, when the government asked for more, they said, why don't you go talk to Danielle? Maybe it's time for Alberta to pony up a few dollars. So that's kind of where we're at now. But these deals, these taxpayers' dollars, their deals are made on the basis of politics. And I argue that there should at least be some minimum due diligence so that Canada can say, okay, we have a moderate degree of confidence that these industries will be around in 20, 30 years. Therefore, it's worth spending another $43 billion to help them build their CCS system. If they haven't done that, that is a dereliction of duty, in my opinion, and they should be harshly criticized for it. And I know they haven't done it.
But that's, I mean, I want to bring you back to the question about the election and the question, like the provincial election, and the question about potentially doing something like tying it to royalty amounts. I mean, we had a conversation with Regan Boychuk not too long ago where he talked about and sort of went through the history of, so the royalties, we're kind of taking a bath. We maybe are giving away a bit of the farm with those things. Why not reclaim back a little bit of the farm with the commitment that whatever is reclaimed gets tied back to carbon capture and storage and putting all of those welding trucks folks back to work? Like, to me, not even having that conversation around something that's tied so close to the culture, as you identified, of so many Albertans, I mean, that could have very easily, for either, I mean, the UCP or the NDP, to me it seems that whoever picked up the ball and ran with that and said, we'll do a study, however you want to make it politically safe. But we'll do a study and we'll see whether or not, if we designated a 2% increase in royalties to go towards carbon capture and storage to secure Alberta's future and make sure we have jobs and nobody touched it. It wasn't a conversation in this election, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on why.
I can tell you exactly why. When Rachel Notley was the premier from 2015 to 2019, there were a number of energy policies that she brought in. I mean, there was some in the climate leadership plan, like the carbon tax, the industrial emitters carbon tax. There was the petroleum incentive program to get more petrochemicals. There was the partial upgrading technology that would have freed up space when you're shipping bitumen. And I went to economists and other experts who said, look, these are good policies. In fact, Dave Collier, who was the CEO of CAP at the time, went on the record and said, yes, Rachel Notley's government has brought in very, very good energy policies. So when 2019 came around and Jason Kenney absolutely pounded her into the ground with the energy narrative, pipelines, pipelines, jobs, and what was the other one? Doesn't matter. That he had an energy narrative and he beat her with it, beat her senseless. And she lost. And she never talked about her policies at all. I wrote a column the day after the election that basically asked the question, why doesn't Rachel Notley talk about her energy policies? Then I wrote another column not too long ago that got me blackballed by the NDP. I said, Rachel Notley has no energy game. She doesn't want to talk about energy. She wants to talk about LGBTQ and education and all sorts of other stuff. And look, don't get me wrong. Those are great policies, but this is Alberta. And if you don't talk about energy, particularly in Calgary, like I lived in Calgary, everybody there understands that your personal financial boat rises and falls with the oil and gas industry. So if you want somebody's vote, you need to explain to them that here I am a competent, I will be competent in my management of the policy and the regulation around oil and gas, and you can rest assured that you'll be you'll be prosperous as a result, blah, blah, blah. They need some hand holding on this kind of stuff. She refuses to do that. And the reason she does it is because there is nobody in her caucus that can talk energy. She can't talk energy. And all of her advisors and her campaign managers can't. Most of them are from Ontario and BC. They don't even know what a well looks like. So there's the problem right there, is you've got a government, you've got a party, the party that wants to run this province and who refuses to run on energy policy. I've been adamant and critical about the NDP about this for years. And if Rachel Notley runs again in 2027 and takes the same campaign strategies that she did in 2019 and 2023, she'll get lambasted again.
It's so, I mean, the slogan, the conversation that I was having with this friend was like, it's too abstract. You can't explain it to people. Sure you can. I'm going to save oil and gas. I'm going to save the environment. I'm going to bring back your jobs, and I'm going to do it by building the leading edge carbon capture and storage infrastructure in the world, in Alberta. And you know what? I'm going to make the oil companies pay for it.
That's a remarkably good elevator pitch. You know what my elevator pitch would have been? I would say, and it kind of mirrors yours actually. I would say there's a global energy transition. Alberta is facing an existential crisis. So I'm going to do two things. One is I'm going to take measures that will protect existing oil and gas companies and existing oil and gas jobs. So we have a suite of policies that will do that. And some of that is cleaning up liabilities and on and on. Then at the same time, I'm going to put in place policies that build this other industry that uses the feedstock, the oil and gas, particularly bitumen, as a feedstock to build, to attract capital, to attract investment by other companies. And we're going to build an advanced materials manufacturing. We're going to support closed loop geothermal, which uses Alberta drilling techniques and technologies. We're going to build that other side of the economy, and we're going to scale it up so that as this other one maybe begins to fade a little bit, our traditional approach, we build up another one to replace it. We'll be more prosperous than ever under those policies.
I mean, there's even a bit where there's an opportunity to say something to the effect of, I'm going to protect federal overreach by showing them how good we are at this game. Like, there's so many different things that they could have done with energy. And when you take a look at the margin of votes in so many of the constituencies, like between the 2% corporate tax increase and whiffing on this, like, it could have been the ball game.
Well, it absolutely could have. And I think that she would have done much better in Calgary had she had an energy narrative. I mean, it's an election. Remember Kim Campbell saying that elections aren't time to talk about serious issues? So what she meant by that is that in the middle of an election, you can't sit down and have a 2-hour conversation about this kind of stuff the way you and I are having. That's not, but you need to have a narrative. You need to reassure voters that you're competent, you have ideas, first of all, you understand what's going on. In a way, Smith hasn't got a clue. Like, I know Danielle. I've been interviewed by her. I moderated a panel where she was one of the members, and we've had conversations about this stuff over the years. She has the buzzwords: hydrogen, emissions. She's got all the buzzwords, and that's where her knowledge stops, right? And so Notley had the opportunity to come in, demonstrate that she understands the severity and the gravity and what issues are at play here, and has some ideas on how to cope with that and make Alberta better in the future than it is today. It's as simple as that. And instead, she avoided the entire conversation. Does anybody remember Rachel Notley saying anything about energy at any point during the campaign? No. I don't remember once. So if you wondered why this didn't come up during the election campaign, and if you're Danielle Smith and your opponent doesn't bring it up, then then you just continue the way you always do, which is Rachel Notley wants to kill. She's going to work with Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh, and they're going to kill the Alberta oil and gas industry. And that's their narrative. And they don't have to talk about anything else because Rachel Notley didn't make them talk about anything else.
It's just so hard for me to wrap my head around why they would, there's, even looking at the last 24 hours in Alberta politics, again, this is being recorded on July 11th, we have a premier who stood beside a guy and posed for multiple pictures who was wearing, it's not like it was subdued. Like, you could look at this shirt and not realize that it's a satirical comment on the Canadian Energy Centre. You could get away with that. But when it's a lime...
I have that t-shirt, by the way.
There we go. But when it's a lime green t-shirt with big, bold letters, it is... I mean, there's so many political scientists who have said there's no question that it was deliberate. There's no question that it was a dog whistle. Now, that's a matter of interpretation and everything, but nonetheless, we find ourselves in a conversation where we're debating whether or not the premier posing for a picture with a guy wearing a plainly bigoted t-shirt was on purpose or just because of incompetence. And for the NDP to have left this stuff on the field just makes me go like, thanks, guys.
Well, they did run on Smith's competence, and that was part of the problem. But I'm not a political science, so I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, that's fair.
But the talking about energy in the modern context, because now you can't just talk about oil and gas anymore. You have to talk about the energy transition. You have to talk about renewables, and you have to talk about electric vehicles. You have to talk about heat pump. It is complicated, Nate. I'm telling you, it is so complex. And there are some smart people like Dr. Sarah Hastings-Simons at the U of C, Dr. Blake Schaefer, economists like that, Dr. Andrew Leach at the University of Alberta, but there aren't many of them. And putting together a suite of policies that takes into account all of what's going on at the global level and then addresses that at the provincial level, maintains or helps the oil and gas industry adapts, builds new industries, scales up some of that. If you're Rachel Notley, you don't want to even go there because it's just too complex. It's not her bailiwick, not her métier. And I get that, but then don't be premier because you need somebody who can do it.
You're not wrong. And I would argue, my perspective would be that the role of government, the role of premier is not to get into the nitty gritty of how you're going to do things. Like, don't tell me how you're going to do a thing, tell me what you're going to do. And if you're competent, then you'll deal with the how part. And I think that we're seeing the degree of competence from Danielle Smith shining through since the election has happened.
Well, look, in all fairness to Sonia Savage, when she was energy minister, she smart, got a master's degree in law and been in the industry for years as a pipeline lobbyist primarily. So she was at least competent. I didn't agree with her very often, and I think she was, but she was an industry spokesperson, basically. And then, Peter Guthrie, her successor, is, he knew nothing about energy. And Brian Jean is even worse because he's a lawyer. Guthrie was at least an engineer. And so now you've got a premier who doesn't get it. You've got an energy minister who's completely clueless. You've got an environment minister who doesn't get it. So where are these ideas coming from? Like, where are we supposed to generate the kind of vision, the kind of narratives, the kind of policies, the kind of conversations? Like, Alberta needs an adult conversation about the future of energy over the next 5, 10, and 20 years. And we need to have it now. Because before that window of opportunity that I've been talking about, before it closes. And Danielle Smith is not capable of leading that conversation. Neither is Brian Jean, neither are anybody else in the cabinet that I could see. So that's not a pro-NDP comment, by the way. That is just observable. Well, that's my take on it anyway. Alberta right now is poorly governed on the energy side, And the prospects of anything changing over the next 4 years are pretty dim.
I wish I could disagree with you. You're only on part 2 of this series, and we've knocked off almost 2 hours just with part 2 and getting caught up to part 2. I would love to be able to have you on again and a little bit farther down the road with the series, but is there anything else that you want people to hear about where you are so far in this series?
Well, part 1 set out the argument. Part 2 is all about conventional oil, and it basically explains how we got to where we are today and how bad it is today. Part 3 will be about the oil sands. And the oil sands, like I've already done a lot of work on that over the years. In fact, in 2019, I wrote a book called The New Alberta Advantage: Technology, Policy, and the Future of the Oil Sands. So I'm pretty well up to speed. The oil sands is infinitely worse than conventional oil. Infinitely worse, because the industry has no clue how it's going to reclaim those tailings ponds. It's talking about, it's going to go to water capping, and it's going to release water into the Athabasca River, which the Indigenous communities are adamant about. There are so many problems, Nate. There's a laundry list, as long as my arm, as long as both my arms, of problems in the oil sands industry, but nobody talks about it. Right. I mean, and everybody's up north, and so out of sight, out of mind. And I'll have that done by the end of August, come hell or high water. So have me on in September, and we'll talk about the oil sands and what a challenge that's going to be, and where the problems are. Like, a lot of these problems are fixable. It's not impossible. But there's no political will, there's no policy direction to the regulator. The industry is very much very influential. I'll just tell you one little story. So I only granted anonymity to 2 people, 2 sources. One was a former Minister of Energy, who still didn't want to be on record for obvious reasons, and the other one was a high-level Alberta energy regulator executive who was responsible for designing data systems. And one day, he wasn't on the executive committee level, which is right below the CEO, but he was invited to sit at a committee level at that committee. And keep in mind, the AER is funded entirely by industry, right? This is an important part. So his story that he told me, which I used in part 1, is the AER executives are sitting there on their side of the table. Industry comes in, they sit down on the other side. They look over at whoever's chairing the meeting, and they go, "We pay for you. We own you. You will do what we say." That's a very, a little bit of paraphrasing going on, but this is what the source told me. And in response, the AER executives went, "Yeah, okay." Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, right, for effect. I mean, we're telling a story, but this is essentially what the source told me. And I have not had anybody associated with the AR, and I've interviewed a pile of them, contradict that story. So the stuff that I'm going to tell you when we get to the oil sands will curl your toes, my friend.
I mean, they're already pretty curled after tonight, but
I will say I've got some family that live in Alberta that are going, when do you think I should sell my house and move somewhere else?
Yeah. Well, I look forward to having that conversation in September. We'll definitely have you back. I will have to fortify and brace myself for it. If tonight is any indication. But I think that these are critically important conversations to have, and God willing, maybe somebody who's writing the scripts for either Danielle Smith or Rachel Notley maybe takes a couple of notes and go, hey, maybe there are some easy things that we could hit on. Because I'll to your point about giving credit to Danielle Smith, at this point in the game, I don't care who doesn't suck as long as they don't suck.
I'm going to tell you another story that will you might not sleep tonight. So earlier this year, the Smith and her government brought out the emissions reduction and energy development plan, or she called it her climate plan, right? And I was scathing in it because it's basically a plan to sell more hydrocarbons, more oil and gas in order to reduce Alberta's emissions. It's just the goofiest plan you could ever imagine. But industry's been pushing this for a long time. So it's essentially industry's plan written up on behalf of the government. So I wrote this column that was quite scathing, evidence-based, of course. And a week or two later, I got this email from a former chief of staff, Premier's chief of staff, UCP Premier's chief of staff, taking me to task for this. And it was drunken gibberish. I assume it was a drunken email, because if this guy was sober while he was writing it, we're all in trouble. And in that email, he said, I had a big hand in writing that document. And he was going on and on about the energy transition and treating me like I was 5 years old and condescending and stuff. And my point here is, if this is the intellectual wattage of the people who are working in the Premier's office, Alberta is screwed.
I would refer you back to the t-shirt situation that we're still trying to navigate in this province, because
It's
Indeed.
I mean, there's a TikToker. I can't TikTok, but there's a TikToker who does political commentary as well, and she has an expression that I think sums up the best possible reaction to the Smith government, and it's just simply every damn day. You can't beat it.
You've just spent a day in my shoes.
there we go.
Every
Mark,
damn day.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat. You've been extraordinarily generous with your time tonight. We were coming up to the 2-hour mark. I may very well split this into 2 parts, because I think that there's so much of this conversation that people need to hear, and there's so much information that you shared tonight that people need to hear, and I want to make sure that they hear it. And I will definitely, when you get that part 2, please let us know so that we can have you back.
Well, thanks, Nate. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at Political Ham, political with ham on the end, sort of a play on my name. You can find me on Facebook and in LinkedIn just by searching my name. And I'm also on Mastodon and Threads. So I'm around. Check me out on social media. Our website is energi.media, and you'll find up in the nav bar, you'll see the Unethical Oil series, so you can read those. And and our YouTube channel, again, Energi Media, where we've got, I think now 12 or 1300 expert interviews. So check that out.
I was just going to say, you opened with Twitter. It's a bold choice these days, sir.
I don't know what to tell you, man. I mean, is there a social media platform that isn't corrupted and a hellscape?
I mean, Twitter's gotten like really bad though, and I will say this: I'm not sure how the Threads algorithm works yet. I would really like to be a little bit more selective about who I'm seeing and how I'm seeing. But boy, over the last like month, Twitter has like the quality has dropped.
I want to say a little thing. You know, one of the because somebody's going to go to my Twitter account and find some of my tweets, which are not a great reflection on my public persona, and I don't take shit from anybody. And that includes, you know, the oil bros and the trolls and the bots who you know frequent these kinds of threads, and they say all sorts of horrible things and they attack you. I give it back as good as I get. Anybody who slides into my DM, be forewarned, because you're gonna get roasted. And as a consequence, I don't get much of it, to be honest.
oh,
And
you're lucky.
I don't. No.
The last week in particular has been a spectacular. And it's the bots are amazing to me because like some of the word salad that these programs are kicking out, it's just like, okay, you included a bunch of the key hateful words there, but none of these sentences work as like sentences. It's wild. It's
Well, what I tend to get is the on Twitter is the guys who are working out in the field, or they feel that to defend Alberta oil and gas from even the slightest criticism is like a patriotic act, right? And they come in and they're really rude and obnoxious and horrible. But here's the interesting thing: on LinkedIn, I'll very often, if I post a political column on my LinkedIn account, I get exactly the same responses from vice presidents, CEOs, people who you would think would be a little more savvy about this kind, interacting, making those kind of comments in public. And yet I stay off LinkedIn for the most part because it's a cesspool. When you get into, if you criticize Alberta oil and gas, people in the industry will come for you, and they are not much different than the bots you just described.
I'm gonna have to create a LinkedIn account for the show so I can post this interview just for fun then.
Make sure you tag me.
Will do for sure. Thank you so much for taking the time tonight, Markham.
It's a pleasure.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case, maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.